All right, so this next segment we're going into is also a drawing-based assignment. The first, as I mentioned, the first project, we were more experimental, more playful, using different effects, mashing things up, seeing where things went, kind of based on the content you grabbed, right? Things could change based on images you're using. Very visual in nature. And your project statements, right? Like talking about those projects was used in connection with the actual image, right? So we had that text as like supplemental. This next project, we're going to be leaning into this design aesthetic to be more specific. And because we are using type in the project, forefronting the project, the consensus is that I should be able to, anyone should be able to read your statement from the visual, from your drawing. We shouldn't necessarily need to read the statement to understand what's going on. So that should set the precedent to the expectation of the assignment. And there's a lot more to come, obviously, until you get to that point, but it kind of lets you know that this is going to be a more calibrated process. And so this lecture, I'm going to be going over like what is vector, but also getting into a little bit of the historical aspects of like art and design and thinking through those different areas more critically, not only to just get a general understanding of like where we are in the world right now and why we're doing this stuff, but also perhaps tapping into your own ability at being more critical in trying to say what it is you're interested in, being more specific with how you're approaching that. And there is this like research component too. So as we're going through, maybe you're going to be stumbling on new elements of something you've had interest in, and you could relate them to us as well. So kicking it off with just the vector stuff, this is kind of a recap from the first lecture where showing you the same image on both sides here. However, the raster ends up being pixelized when it's enlarged, whereas the vector is not. And you can see here, I selected a part of this vector image, and you can see all of the different vector plotted points. Each of these dots is a point, a vector point. So a vector image is based on these mathematically plotted points, but also the curved lines in between the points. So each one of these points, unless it's a straight edge, right, like a corner, will generally have a curved line associated to it. And that curve is scalable. These plotted points on a graph are scalable. So that's why this is able to be a very small image and scaled up, and it's not losing any of the detail because we're just moving the plotted points to new areas, and we're still filling that space with the same content, replicating that. So I'll be going into like pros and cons of why you'd be using vector over raster, and trying this semester to be a little bit more specific in why it matters that you have the ability at modifying within these two different realms, within raster, within vector. A lot of people, I feel like, probably take the course, courses like this. They pick up one program, they default to the program, and then they stick with that program. And then, you lose the ability of having the knowledge and insight and skills at being more versatile. So I'm going to try to shift a little bit more of my explanation this semester to be around why you should have the knowledge for both of these. So as I specified, vectors based on its endpoints, these vector plotted points. The big thing here is that we are not dependent on resolution. In Photoshop, we'd have to set the actual resolution of the image, the width and the height. And then we also had to set the dots per inch. And that would, in collaboration with the two, that would specify how many pixels wide by how many pixels tall. We still can set those dimensions here in vector, right? If we're going to print something or we're going to export an image for a specific size. But the main point here is that we don't rely on whatever we started with. Vector points exist without resolution. The big example, I guess I would say, is that if you designed something for a business card very small, and then that's in vector, and you scale that up to a billboard, it would still retain the full quality. Whereas it would not in, if you were doing it in vector or raster, like Photoshop. Postscript is the term I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. It's like the underlying language, if you will, that retains these mathematical points. So I'll talk about that in a second here. Because raster is based on pixels, we do have that more of that photorealistic sense of images relying on these individually colored pixels to create shapes, shades of realistic things in the real world. Whereas vector is more along the lines of graphics, and really it's hard to not default to, but realistically you can tell when something's vector most often because of the fact that they do have these large areas of solid color. The lines are solid in color. Obviously, it's all dependent on the workflow of said place. Like I showed Family Guy images. Do they make all of their stuff in vectors? I don't know. Maybe. They definitely look like it, right? What else is there to say here? Vectors are very small as a footprint. Once you're done with this project, I had mentioned before, and you compare your Illustrator file to your Photoshop file, you're going to see just how dramatic the difference is. And then there's another point here. So just in general, some other like generalized uses for vector drawings that you would be thinking about. would be logos. Logos are a huge one. Text-based images, really like anything text type in general. Scientific drawings or graphs, things that need to retain that quality no matter what, wherever they're presented at. So then I just give you an example of another, just to reiterate how you take an image in vector and you scale it up. It literally is the same as you zoom in. So this is the kind of breakdown of the file formats that you should be familiar with. So just like in Photoshop, I walked you guys through a little bit more of the specifics for file management, how to not just be able to create an image, but also form that content into the mold of which you're using it for, right? Like thinking that through, is this going to be used for web? What's the file size it needs to be? Am I going to be sending this via email to somebody else? Are they going to have to work on it? Or are they just going to look at it? There's a lot of these factors that you should be aware of. And if you're already going through all this effort to learn the program, to know how to use it to draw and lay things out, it's only another quick step to really harness the ability to, wrangle that content in a more professional way. So obviously Adobe Illustrator is one that we're going to be dealing with the most, right? That's the file we're working in, like Adobe Photoshop was. However, just like Photoshop, there are alternative programs. So the big one for vector-based images would be the alternative program called Affinity Designer. It's also considered an industry standard because of its popularity as an alternative or as an alternate. And I actually tried out for a position for a sign company after my undergrad to get a job and like doing design work and such. And they use Affinity Designer. So I got to toy around with it. Definitely drastic changes, but the premise is the same. The way in which we're using vectors. And I didn't get the job. I was overqualified, is what they told me. I could see that. It's a lot of places, like smaller towns, they want to invest in someone that's kind of like, oh, we want you forever. I had aspirations of continuing school. I didn't necessarily say that, but I think they probably got that vibe. So continuing on, Postscript is more along the lines of like this underlying language that vectors utilize. Most programs need to be able to read that. It's very specific to programs that read vector file formats. And beyond that, you want to be able to look at the image, whereas an EPS file is an encapsulated Postscript. Encapsulated meaning you should be able to open that up in a variety of like image previewing kind of programs and still see the image, but it retains the vector format. So examples are kind of like in Photoshop, we can still export PDFs with Illustrator. But just like in Photoshop, how we had that ability to like retain Photoshop editing capability, or you know, managing how we were exporting the file from the original Photoshop file, the colors and all of these different components. That's really what the EPS file is as well. It allows you to remain to have that editing capability should you bring it into another vector program. And so in my experience, when sharing or collaborating on vector program files, I always also include EPS with my, you know, with my files that I share. And similar, I don't know if I covered this in Photoshop, but you can, in like Adobe CC with Photoshop, you can save it as a legacy file format for Photoshop. So say somebody has CS6, which is the generation of Photoshop before the cloud. You can't open an Adobe CC file in the old version. You have to downgrade the save from CC to then be able to open in said legacy format. Same thing with EPS or with Adobe Illustrator. We have that ability of, you know, like encapsulating that vector data for legacy formats. So just like the first project, I'm requiring you guys to do like a flattened PDF to include with your submission, right? Like doesn't retain Photoshop editing, removes layers, just saves a copy. Kind of understanding that technical ability. I'm going to have you guys do that as well with the EPS, kind of like retroactively saving it. So you have an understanding of that approach. But vector data can also be applied in PDF. It's just, I personally don't see that as often. It's kind of like how I mentioned before. You could send a full res file from Photoshop as a PDF to somebody to print, but you kind of, I would be defaulting to using like a TIFF file. It just kind of things become standards and preferences and so forth. EPS seems to be like the default, at least in my realm of insight for vector stuff. This is all a recap of color stuff from the first lecture. In the past, this class would be doing printing for both projects. And because this would then be the second project for printing, we would start to get a little bit more specific in color management. But we are not printing. So we're going to gloss over that. We're just going to be sticking with RGB color space. But we do have, you know, still a sense of wanting to understand spot colors to some extent. Because out of all, you know, I think almost 40 students now in both these classes for this semester, I would assume that one of you, bare minimum, would have to be dealing with some libraries, some spot color libraries over your career. So it's good to have a general idea of kind of like learning a, you know, color wheel when you're in elementary school. How do you make orange? So spot colors are, you know, just like in Photoshop, we can go to window to choose any of these other tabs to turn on. We have a libraries section of colors. And there's a lot of them. And Pantones are basically just like one of the different formats. So say like you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and they have their own brand of paint, and all of those have different color chips you could look at. They formulated those colors and they set a standard for their own colors. Whereas these sorts of spot colors are more broadly recognized like as a global standard. So if you were trying to match a specific color of fabric to a specific, you know, rubberized ink that you're printing on a handbag or something, and you need them to be the same color or something, right? You would have to be collaborating at that level with people. Maybe somebody's in California designing. Part of it's being produced, manufactured in Taiwan. Printing is going to be done in Japan. How do you get all these things to be not collaborated, but calibrated correctly, right? What's the standard? This Pantone is the standard. So not only is it digital, but they also have like books, and the books can be sent out so you can match by color and person. So it kind of looks like this, right? It has just a library of colors. Also can break down into more subcategories for each of the libraries. This is all pretty complex. We're not going to get into this specifically. I'm just showing you guys like it exists, right? This is how things are made on a more calibrated, larger scale. For our purposes, Illustrator also has another window guide you could turn on called Color Guide. And I would expect all of you to be using this for your projects in the sense that because we are being more specific with design, one of the easiest ways to abide by that is creating some sort of color uniformity or color color theory, right? So maybe your project's supposed to be upholding a sense of urgency. Well, then maybe you would pick like opposing colors, right, on the color wheel, and they would be dramatically segregated from one another. Or maybe your image is based on promoting love and kindness. Well, maybe then you'd have similar colors, right? And you could use this color guide to find those colors that you want to use. And I'll show you next week how to use it. Very simple, very, I almost use it every time I'm doing a new design rather than going on the web and doing all these calculations, right? The color guide's really, really simple to pick up. Yeah, so that's the majority of my chatter on vectors and, you know, rehinting at color abilities. The rest of the stuff for this lecture is getting into more of a historical sense of how we have come to where we are now, like where we stand. Why do you matter? You know, why are you here right now doing this thing? So all of this is just good for context. But I like to preface this by, oh, I forgot one of the big things that I was going to talk to you about. I'm sitting here rambling. I ignored a lot of my notes because I've already done this once today. I wasn't so good now, was I? Yeah, I think it's around here. So here's a question for all of you. If you know how to use Photoshop now and you can make a poster for it, right? And you say, oh, well, your mom told your plumber friend that you know how to do computer drawings, and the plumber's like, oh, well, I'm starting my business. Can you make some stuff for me? I don't know how to do it. You know, I'll give you $100 or whatever, right? Who's not going to take $100? So you know how to use Photoshop. You remember it well. but you didn't really remember Illustrator, for example. Say you have access to both, you just remember Photoshop really well. What do you guys think are the pros and cons of that? Like, what would you want to be using Photoshop, or would you want to be using Illustrator, or why? Why one or the other? If you don't remember Illustrator, would you want to relearn it?
You would probably get a better product from Illustrator.
Well, why? It's a good guess. Not to put you on the spot. Looking for like a specific kind of any kind of or like thought is good here. Who else has thoughts?
Bernard, are you talking about like in terms of like creating documents or like, you
Yeah,
know,
just your plumber buddy. It's like, hey, make me some files. I need some digital files.
I would use Illustrator because since it's more like text friendly, you obviously have to have that type of information on your flyer or whatever you're creating. And I guess since it's more vector-based art, it comes out cleaner.
Well, say he wants one of the things he wants is a poster. You can set that poster dimension in Photoshop and print it. It's not going to look bad. Right?
But yeah, no, I see what you mean. But I mean, regardless, I feel like I would lean more towards Illustrator for a type of project like that.
But in this context, you don't remember how to use it very well.
So I would make it work with Photoshop.
Yeah. So does anybody have any other thoughts? Like, are we missing out on something here, or are we saving time, or like, why? Anybody else have thoughts? This is a pretty big deal. This thing I'm hinting towards here.
Yeah, I would ask him what type of like image he's going for. Is it like cartoony or like vector based, or is it like photorealistic? Is he using images of him working or something like that? I would ask for that first.
Yeah. That could be helpful as well. So the big thing here, and this is why we're doing a second project with an image, with a different program, is the fact that for Photoshop, that's going to be more along your lines of photorealistic images using actual photos, right, from a camera as your predominant kind of content. And that's reworking images, right? So polishing stuff for a variety of ways. But in reality, you don't necessarily need to only use Photoshop for that. That could just be one part of the piece. Illustrator, because we're able to scale things in vectors, like type, for example, or a logo, right? If you made a logo in Photoshop for a business card, that's all the plumber wanted. I want a business card. I want you to make a logo for it. You made the logo, you gave it to him. You don't have the files anymore. It's been 2 years. He comes back to you. Hey, my business is picked up. I need you to make a bunch more stuff for me. Right? I'll pay you $3,000. I want you to do a website and some marketing materials or whatever. So the thing here is that if you had that original, obviously having the original files is always going to be better, but scaling, you would not be able to scale that small business card up to a larger image. Having stuff done in Illustrator and vectors gives you the versatility of using that for any purpose. That's the big thing. That's the kicker. You have that freedom of using it for whatever purposes you may need that for. And now, that being said, that doesn't mean you should always just use vector because it's going to be the most convenient for any purpose. As we know, we should know, at least we'll get into it more, but you can't use photographs very well with vector. So because we are learning the two programs, they're both the same company. Most of the time you're going to have both programs and more. The point is that they have these programs that are separated, right? They don't just make Adobe all in one program. They have these separated for different reasons, different teams, different purposes. You can take an image, modify it, rework it, do whatever you want to it in pixels, right? And then bring that exported file into your graphic design program and use it as a background or what have you. So obviously you're limited by pixels, but the consensus is a lot of the stuff that you're fabricating that may need to be changed in scale, you're always better off in trying to build that up in Illustrator, in a vector-based program. So that's the real reason we're getting into this, is so that you guys have that versatility in creating both image types and knowing how to use them in collaboration with one another. It all depends on what the task at hand is. But so once you start to surpass like a single image, you're starting to kind of build up towards like a marketing campaign, towards creating all this content for a website or for business, right? Like if you're going to make all that content, if the person wants the ability of having that freedom of expanding down the road and such, you're most likely going to be dealing with the vector stuff. Come on. We're getting there. We're getting there. Okay, next question. Who pays for art? Tanner. Who pays for art, Tanner? What do we got?
I don't know. Like anyone who needs like a logo, I guess.
Anyone who needs it. Becca, who pays for art?
Whoever commissions the piece or the thing.
Somebody who wants to create something specific. Oakley, who pays for art?
Like everybody, because there's like pretty much art on everything around us. So yeah.
Pretty much everybody. There's all these different ways, right? Could be institutions, could be governments, could be individual people, everybody, right? Now, currently, what about 200 years ago?
Rich people.
Rich people?
Religious organizations.
Yeah, just to some degree.
I could be wrong, but from what I think I know, during the Renaissance, there were Patreons, or maybe it's a different time period, but yeah, there was like people who would pay artists, you know, like supporters.
Yep, and that's kind of getting a little bit ahead. Well, I'm going to get into that a little bit here. But yeah, yeah, kind of like people commissioning work to be done. So this is a pretty interesting, complex point about art. And I mean, if you guys ever sat down and thought about it, art itself, which, you know, that's really the core of this whole class. Yeah, we're dealing with computers, we're dealing with designing, laying out, fabricating digital content, digital stuff. It all comes down to art. We're creating things, creative creation, right? And when it comes down to how we're doing all of this stuff, it really can be helpful to see like where we've come. So we're not making same mistakes, obviously, but then also a general consensus is, it's something that you probably all have picked up on already, is like there's this like unspoken thing about art that everyone's always striving to create something new that hasn't been done before. But why? I mean, what does that urge come from, you know? It's kind of an interesting complex. But so if we're thinking back and kind of first kind of kick us back to these different times, building us up through these movements, so you guys all get a better sense of, you know, kind of where we are right now, and thinking through on these different kind of realms of thought and how art was made through these different realms of thought will also help you, it should help you in being more critical in deciding on how you are going to represent this image that you're going to be doing, in this light of trying to be more specific with our image. So continuing on here. So Mohammed was kind of talking a little bit about kind of like these what's the term you used? I'm trying to I'm blanking up here.
Patreons?
Yeah, so there's another term for that too. I think it's a French term. I'm blanking on it. It's essentially like in the past, those who paid for art in the traditional times, which I probably should just throw a slide on here of. So say like 400 years ago, 500 years ago, 800 years ago. It's people who had all the money and power. It's kings, it's later monarchies, it's religious groups, churches, right, in the Western sphere of things. And using like the church as an example, during those years, like 200, 300 years, what have you, where religion kind of rules the world, you really only find art that's religious in connotation. It's because they were deciding what the work was going to be about, and they are paying. And actually, most usually, they're not really even paying. A lot of times, like, you're a painter for a king, because if you don't paint him something, you're just going to be killed, right? It's not straight up that all the time, but like often in the past, there wasn't really an income source. Like you did what you had to do because you had to do it, right? And you were being controlled in that way. So it wasn't until these more modern times, right, this sense of modernism, where people started breaking free from these traditional norms, that there was this elitist few that were in control of everyone, right? And this sparked from a lot of different reasons, like scientific breakthroughs, different areas of study. But in reality, we see it in art, like this break from, because artists all of a sudden have the ability of doing so. And in some regard, yes, it is due to patrons paying artists to create this content. But in a sense, like, a patron didn't commission the artist to draw this painting, to paint this. This painter had been growing up through this lifestyle of getting commissions from different people who could afford it, meaning that society already broke this sense of a few elite people down to now there's this middle class being formed, right? And this middle class all of a sudden starts to want these different luxuries that the elite have, right? And this sense of a middle class, between like the best of the best, the most powerful, and those that are worth nothing, quote unquote, to society. Those in the middle are the ones that are now funding that art. And because the art can be paid for, all of a sudden there's artists that are living in their own right because they can be commissioned by other people to make things. And because these artists are now no longer forced to make things that they don't have to make, they start to be more open and creative in their exploits, right? And strive to kind of keep upward this momentum towards like a better future. And yeah, so art kind of formed these movements and helped these movements spark towards liberation and moving forward towards this more modern time. So modernism isn't the definition isn't like modern times. Modernism is an art movement that was like this late 1800s, early 1900s. So it sparked this kind of new energy in society. I do have a quote here that I don't have too many quotes often. This is a pretty powerful one. So modernism, it rejected historical and cultural traditions, and it affirms the power of human beings to make, improve, and reshape their environment with the aid of scientific knowledge, technology, and practical experimentation. So it's like this very well crafted uprising in society that's kind of being undertaken. So following on from that period, like earlier 1800s, mid 1800s, getting towards the end or the beginning of this 19th century, or 20th century, I should say, artists started being able to go beyond just needing to create to sustain their life, but then becoming a profession in its own right and sharing these new ideas. And the new ideas is what sparked this whole sense of like the art museum and art galleries and so forth, that we're able to be more open to, more accessible to everyone, right? Like, and these museums, these institutions started to create these spaces to show this kinds of work. So for example, we're talking about new thoughts, right? From old thoughts. Picasso was one of the people that had this earlier movement in terms of going a different direction, right? In a different way. And this was the first painting, first Cubist painting, Cubism, ever made, arguably. And the whole concept behind Cubism is to show multiple perspectives of the same subject. So like you see me right now from the front on, right? You could break me down into planes pretty easily from this perspective. But then if I was in like a side perspective at the same time, and you took both of those perspectives and you mashed them up into one two-dimensional image, that's the notion of Cubism, is to portray multiple perspectives in one plane. It's kind of a unique thought, right? And it's taking that notion and running with it and going on. And there ended up being a whole era of Cubism with other artists collaborating and talking and developing. And so these notions of sub-creation of these different movements kept moving forward. And eventually, through this notion of creating museums and galleries and more like art for global consumption, not just for consumption of the elite or just the consumption of the middle class, but now anybody can freely move around, go to these places and look at things. Art became more of a more everyday essential, right? And people wanted to have this more and more for the lower end of the middle class. And so there's this demand that kind of came up for education, right? Getting people to be trained in these different areas to obviously pursue passions, but also creating the institution itself also is a moneymaker, right? There's a demand. If there's enough demand, you got to pick up on that and run with it. So this one architect, Walter Gropius, he's the main component here that built up this structure, this new structure of education called the Bauhaus. And this started in Germany, 1926, right? So around the World Wars period. And the whole consensus was not just traditional art, like you're going to go learn to draw, and now you're going to learn to do perspectives, and now you're going to learn how to do shading, and now you're going to learn how to sculpt or whatever it is, right? The Bauhaus was designed to take all of your different interests from different studies and blend them together more seamlessly. So the first approach was, obviously, he's an architect using art and architecture, but then it also formed into using like science, technology in with art. What's some other components here? Hello. I guess I'm kind of running dry. Visual art, architecture, design, and design. So having all these different realms of focus all under one roof allowed for a lot more experimentation and, you know, toying in thoughts. And this really led to like an outgrowth in different movements as well. So kind of going out from this moment in time, we have a lot of different like isms that happened, a lot of different subgroups of people kind of getting together to study different thoughts towards like what might be the new interesting thing. And this one movement, for example, focused in on these structures, like underlying structures, and not just art, but structures of all things. And they have a lot of different classifications and like rules, and they like all of these different movements with people, they end up forming like a collective statement, you know, like I'm blanking on the term, forming together to create this unified idea. And then everyone within that sphere of influence is trying to make work and work within that same sphere of influence, right? So within this of structuralism, one of the interesting points they brought out is studying language as a structure. And they found that there is no meta language to explain like what language is. Like, to explain language, you have to use language. That language is the bottom bricks. Like you can't really get any lower than that, right? So any kinds of communication that you're having with someone is based on language, even if you speak a different language than somebody else, right? Like you show them a fist angrily, they understand that as a language that you're upset or angry, right? So just an interesting kind of concept. Then kind of stemming from that, there's also like post-structuralism, which is kind of a group that strived to undermine structuralism in a sense of like challenging those preconceptions, right? Just because a group got together and said, oh, hey, everything here is what we say it is, doesn't really sit well with some people, right? So there's other groups that have come together to kind of challenge different things. And this was the first one that comes to mind. And this is, there's not a lot of images within this group either, but this is just one example. A lot of you have probably seen this in the past. So if I asked you guys, what is this that you're looking at, right? If you're not familiar with it already, you're going to say, oh, it is a pipe, right? But in French here, this text is saying, this is not a pipe. And the whole premise is that it is not a pipe, it's a painting of a pipe, right? The structure, the underlying structure that we assume is incorrect. So they're toying with this notion that, you know, structure doesn't always mean, it's not always definitive. And I could go even one step further at this point and say, this is not a painting of a pipe either, right? This is a digital rendering of a painting of a pipe, right? You're looking at the third iteration of such drawing. Or maybe the fourth, it's going through the internet from my computer. I don't know if that's considered a fourth, but we can pretend if we want. We could be the post-structuralist group. So getting on through that like challenging notion of these different kinds of movements, we have this postmodernism era, right? Where these artists start to challenge those traditional norms that were set by the modern era, or this modernism era. And let's see. start to have movements like intermedia, right? Different types of media coming together, installation art, conceptual-based art, multimedia, postmodern kinds of stuff. And I will note that Warhol specifically, there is a pretty awesome, if you like that style, that era, there's a pretty awesome museum, Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, which is where Warhol was from. I didn't know that until I was going to visit Pittsburgh and seen it. It's a pretty nice museum, and there's a few other museums in Pittsburgh that are worth checking out, specifically for like this area of postmodern study. So like installation art, digital arts. There is one gallery in Pittsburgh that focuses in on like experimental audio-visual installation stuff. And it's probably one of 3 that I've been able to find in the East Coast. From being like asking other faculty, there's probably only like a couple on the West Coast as well. So like nationally, there's only probably like 5 or 6. One of them is in Canada that focuses in like presenting this type of, robotics, any kinds of like computerized different installation art, sound art, things like this. So if you do want a chance to explore some of that stuff that you're actually going to school for, Pittsburgh isn't that far away. It's not as hard to navigate as New York City if you're not accustomed to traveling. So, and then all of this stuff is on our vocab sheet. But essentially, visual like vocabulary is really just like the building blocks. I try to situate this to you guys as like, these are the building blocks that build up to making an image. And then the visual grammar is using these building blocks and compiling them to create a grammar. And there's different approaches, right? You could have one shape. Well, one shape's always going to be one shape. You're not going to really be able to create movement from one shape or proportion from one shape or a balance from one shape, right? There's got to be other attributes. And that's where the grammar comes in. And what I like to suggest now that we've shifted from vocab quizzes and getting a better learning of what these are, right? Like a better formal understanding of studying them is when you go out to do your sketches, right? The whole premise with those is that I want you guys to solidify your concept first, right? Your proposal. Really strive from locking it in right from the get-go and sticking with it. Not just changing the concept because doing the sketches was challenging, right? You're going to write the proposal because you're interested in it. So then I would urge you to stick with that, and then we'll figure out how to move forward with that. And to challenge yourself or to open yourself up to more ideas if you're struggling with sketches is try to do thumbnails based in different types of these visual grammar areas. And so I'm going to give you some examples here. These 2 types of posters, right? They're obviously different content, so it's not the greatest example. But in terms of all of these different types of visual grammar, like what which one of these bullets would be attributed to all of them, or both of these? What do you guys think?
Would you say balance?
Yeah, and balance, and kind of could be dealing with like a formal or informal. That's one way of thinking about balance. And here, this first image is very centralized, right? Nothing's hanging off the edge. It's encapsulated, framed, if you will. It's got easy to read text. It's got images for supplemental, and then it's got like a follow-up with a logo, right? Everything's very centralized. This is based on balance, right? We all know this symbol is based on this harmony or balance, but it's deliberately being shoved off the side to challenge that notion of balance, right? So it's being deliberate. So two different approaches, right? You could have the same concept proposal and create a visual in these two different ways, right? It just depends on which way you would go with it. Another example could be here. This is Unity and Harmony, right? This is like an advertisement for some kind of digital equipment, but it's basing it off of, oh, you're going to be using this for music making. So let's just plaster this with, the similar music making of like a guitar or a musician creating this music. Another one would be movement, right? And you could clearly all tell this is a still image. We could all tell these all slid down from that first starting point, right? We're not looking down here. We're not looking down here. Clearly, we can't read it, number one, but our focus is on these shapes moving, right? I would argue that this is like all what we think about. This motion that's happening. What's interesting is because then we're drawn to this area, thinking like looking at these shapes, we also conveniently have the title type right over top of it, right? Like this main point. This is like good design in a sense. It draws your eye in and it plasters you with the main focus of what this is about, right? Oh, financial solutions. Oh yeah, I do need financial solutions. If you're one of those people, you're going to start reading the subtext, right? So that's another approach, visual grammar, an approach. Here we have proportion. Clearly, a dandelion seed head is not going to be larger than a woman's head. We played a little bit with proportion in the first project for like deliberately creating that sense of urgency or challenging like preconceptions. Could be another use here. And I think the last one got deleted a long time ago, and then here's all the design vocab that some reason I meticulously spaced out, but everybody should know as of 20 years ago. I don't know, maybe not 20 years ago. Some of you might be 20 years old. Let's say 10 years ago. And then all these font terms, they're going to be somewhat talked about in the film, so I'm not going to go over them in detail. It's better to probably just watch the film and then check these out. Things to note are, and we're going to go over some of this stuff when we get into the tutorial as well, exercise in class. But the big one is serif versus sans-serif fonts. Like which typeface are you going to be using? A serif, that word, is associated to like the little feet that you would have on a letter form, right? So some fonts, they look like more that old traditional type. They've got these little feet on all. Those are called serifs. And the font themselves is a family of fonts, or any fonts that would have those serifs, right? Versus sans-serifs would be like both of these typefaces that don't have any serifs, right? So the other ones I'll let you read. Ligatures, here's just a quick example too, because I've seen this earlier. A ligature is any time where you have like symbols that are supposed to be next to one another, or letters that are next to one another that are overlapping. So right here's one example, like the top of the I is being mashed into the F. If this was like a title or a name of somebody, you wouldn't want that. It just isn't formal, unless you're trying to be informal, right? But like American Eagle, they use AE. That's another ligature, right? And last thing to note is that on a Mac specifically, there is a program. It's a system level program called Fontbook. So you could just search it in the Finder window, Fontbook, and you could download fonts online. So if you guys find that you need some fonts that aren't installed in your machine or within your package, you could go on the web, find free fonts, find one you like, download it, drag the folder right in here, and boom. Now it's a system-wide accessible font. There is a feature in Adobe now for fonts, font management. It probably works pretty good. I just haven't used it myself, so I don't know if it's system level installment or if it's Adobe wide level installment. I'm not sure. But we will also reiterate later, like next week, how because all of you have to use fonts for this project, there is a big downside to using fonts, a requirement. When you share a program file with someone and you're using type, you can't assume the other person has your fonts. Like if you have a notebook out, you should probably write something along those lines down and underline it and circle it with a black Sharpie and star it. That when you go to submit this project, you must have the correct management of your type. Every semester, at least a third of students, if not 3/4, mess up in some capacity. And I'll talk about it a lot. So in general, you would either want to also include your font with the file, like in a folder, right? Or like in this case, I'm not going to be collaborating with you, so to speak. So you could then like expand your type before you submit it to me. Therefore, I don't need your type. It's converted to vectors. It's an image now. Therefore, I don't need the font. It's now pixels, or it's now vectors. So we'll be talking about the two. It is listed as a requirement on the project page. That's what I'm talking about, is you have to manage the font correctly. It seems like an annoying little thing, but that's really what it is. It's an annoying thing. If you are working with other people and you don't include it, it ends up just being an annoyance for all parties. So it's good to kind of, just like labeling your layers. If you haven't done that in Photoshop, right? It's a requirement. Just like that, it's like being able to keep track of things and having access and that sort of thing. Okay, that's it for this. Does anybody have questions? All right. I'm just going to take a quick minute break here, go use the restroom, bathroom in the house here. And then I'll kick into project 2, talk about that, and look at some examples. So I'll be back in a second. Okay, hello again. Project 2. So, obviously, we're gonna all want to make sure we have watched Helvetica first before doing this intro stuff here. I'm gonna let you guys read the majority of it. I'm just gonna cover the basic components. So this is gonna be an exploration of the potential of digital manipulation of type to get us away from using traditional typography and design. So we're gonna be harnessing elements of design typography in our images. But this isn't gonna be like a traditional typography course, right? Like I've taken one of these before. They're much more strict, really thinking through the thought that, oh, language is very specific and very important. How do you relate this type to uphold that importance of language and what you're trying to convey, right? And then expanding on that and using type as image while also conveying. So there's a lot of this backstory of typography, but the consensus is that you're going to use that video that you have as an assignment and use that to tap into this realm that you might have not otherwise known about and starting to think about things in a different way. And then once you kind of get through that, you're going to design a work that speaks out on an issue involving politics and technology. This is the point where I want all of you to stop thinking about American politics and overall generalized technology like the computer or the internet. I want you guys to be specific, like hone in on something specific of each of these two pieces. What are you interested in, right? Like what I was telling the other class is, I think I'll just use the same example from the other class. I don't remember what, I named some random kid. We'll say David. David's a little boy and he sits on his iPad too much and his mom wants him to get off the iPad. So she says, all right, David, if you only use your iPad for 1 hour a day, you'll get a cookie. And it's using a cookie as this means of enforcing a positive outlook on limiting the use of technology and why limiting use of technology is important, right? That's something very simple. Who's the audience of that? Like parents, right? Cognitive development of people, like, right? So you're kind of choosing what your interests are and deciding what's something specific in those interests. So again, this is a very open project. However, it starts to be very specific once we get into drawing things. Because this project, we're being more specific and we're using type. And so in the end, right, after you come up with this concept and now we're starting to visualize what this could be, the design must function on two levels: text as image and image as text. For some reason, a lot of people get confused on this. It's really just the fact of using type to create an image right? You look at it first and foremost as it being an image, not something you read, but also elements of that you do read, right? So as an example here, this is pretty small. Oh, there we go. So here, this is an image of a cookie being dunked into someone's head as a cup of milk, right? Like a got milk kind of knockoff. And all of the milk is structured to look like milk splattering. That's type as image. But also, you could read all of that type. And I'm going to be willing to bet that that type is alluding to the project statement. And it's telling us what we are looking at. Got info? Oh, what kind of info are we talking about? We keep reading into the supplemental text and we're going to find out. Right? So it's really thinking about this in two stages, this project. The first and foremost is deciding on that specific area of politics and technology. Like I said, a lot of people focus in on the big global or national things. If that's really what's interesting to you, go for it. I'm willing to also bet that there's a lot of like local community things you could focus on. Are you a family-oriented person? What kinds of family politics are there that you could pick up on, right? And how do those influence you, or talking about that? How could that, there's a lot of layers here that you could be tapping into, not just on like how Trump uses Twitter, you know what I mean? Or how he used to use Twitter. Yes. So anybody have, so coming up with the concept, and then once that's done, once that's solidified, I would leave it. Don't be going back and changing things. Coming up with ideas can be challenging, but if you are undermining yourself, it's going to be worse, right? Come up with something that you're interested in, do minimal research, kind of get to that point, decide, yeah, I'm going to do QR codes and eating disorders. I don't freaking know. Okay, great. Then do a project on that. You could be, it could be speculative design, right? It doesn't have to exist in the real world. Maybe it's a communication platform so you can talk to aliens. I don't really, sweet, go for it. Let's see what it is. This is making sense. Like, it should be very open, but also then not worrying about the visual of it until you get to start sketching things. And that's why I say, like, try to use those different visual grammatical structures as different approaches at some of the thumbnails to get you to maybe take some more time to think through some different ways of approaching the same concept, and the more variation you can get once you talk to people in the class, that's when you're going to have that, collaboration of ideas or affirmation of your concepts with one another. A lot of times this project it ends up being like a mashup of a couple of sketches. It doesn't always end up being one sketch. So as long as you're trying to diversify and sticking to your original statement, I think it's going to be pretty fun. So questions, there's got to be some.
When did you say you need our ideas in by?
Sunday. So it'd probably be good to actually probably try to get it done by Saturday. The point is like here in a little bit, I'll be sending out like new partner lists in email via email. And I'd like for you guys to meet up over the weekend before things get too crazy during the week, right? You should all have like a half hour to chat on one of the days of the weekend, I would think. Just to kind of see what it is you guys are thinking about doing, get that overlap, and then scour the web together for a few minutes, find a source that you're going to be using as your like research piece. However you want to come up with finding that link. So again, same premise as before, except we're going to hold off on the actual like writing for this week. I'll fill you guys in the updates for that next week. The point though is like still using some of that research in helping you with your sketches. And then once we talk about sketches in class, you'll also then use some of that research in talking about your peers' work. Yeah, on next Wednesday. So there obviously are student examples. We could just browse through a couple. There are stuff from the first class I used to teach, but they're pretty similar. I'm going to go backwards. Let's go backwards. So a lot of different kind of structures here. Some of them are better than others in terms of type as image. Some of them are better than others in terms of upholding the project like statement visually, right? Like we don't have the statement here to review. So how well can we read these with just type, right? So they're all here. You can go take a look at them if you want to get some kind of varying layouts and such. But I think what could be more important than just looking at past student stuff is just looking at like real world examples of people using type. If anybody's on campus that goes to the library, the one library at UB, they should have a ton of magazines, you know, like periodicals, right? And you just go browsing through the aisles of periodicals and find design magazines. I list a few things here that you can research. I might just resubscribe to this because I don't get a magazine anymore, but I used to love getting Wired. Wired is based on technology. So they often sometimes cover like gaming, other critical components of technology that influence the world, different gizmos and such. But it's also a very well like graphic. The graphic design aspects are very well done. So I wonder if we can see. It used to be able to like let us preview some of the pages, but maybe not. Here, let's just do a general search. These are all just covers. See, like this is just a letter, but like using type in different ways, right? You're going to be able to find a lot of this stuff by looking at content that's, you know, designed specifically with this design in mind. So you're not going to be able to just open up any old magazine and find stuff, but and this is just one example. It's just Wired magazine. A lot of it's going to be based on layout design, right? For like a catalog for a magazine, but not necessarily all of it, right? The dark world of society, playing around with letter forms. So there are going to be a lot of examples of that here and there. It's just a matter of finding them. On top of that, I lost my page. Tips on how to design a poster. So there's different things about, you know, if you're going to take the approach of a poster, like different things to be taking into consideration. What else? Typography section here. Anybody have questions? Like once you go through and design your concept and map that out into words and submit that, and you start to get onto this task of doing some quick sketches, that's the time you want to go out and start getting some inspiration visually. Because if you find a structure that you're like, oh, I like this style, could it work for my concept? If the answer is maybe, just steal the concept and implement your content into that structure. Who's to say you can't steal a design, right? So, yeah, if nobody has questions, I mean, you guys are good to go. Is anybody thinking that they'll need to come around for office hours today? I mean, the general consensus has been no, although I often urge it, but I guess you guys don't know how I grade things either. So after the first project, you'll see how things go. And then as the second one is coming to a close, that'll probably give you a better sense of like, oh yeah, well, maybe I could use some insight on whatever. Am I doing this correctly or blah, blah, blah. So sweet. Have a good weekend. Everybody get out of your house, do something.
So I can already tell I'm a little stuck on trying to decide a topic.